What's up everyone, I'm Sublight Drive, and I have too many pieces of plastic. Okay, maybe not too many, but certainly more than I know what to do with. I really like model ships as a source for Greeblies, because they have all sorts of cool tiny details. However, these kits also include bigger parts that I haven't been able to find a good use for, things like hulls or landing decks. I've also got a few parts in this box from a 1/35 scale tank and a Saturn V kit that I only ever use the booster rockets for. Because most of my projects are working from a particular piece of concept art, I don't often find a good use for these pieces. They're really big and very specifically shaped, which means they don't really fit into my process, where the bigger shapes I tend to scratch build out of styrene. So for this video, I'm going to try and actually do some kitbashing rather than scratch building, and use up as many of these big pieces as I can. I'm not going at this with a particular design in mind. Instead, I'm letting the parts themselves guide me. How do they fit together? What arrangements do a good job of disguising what they used to be? I had it in my head that whatever the result is, it should be clearly inspired by the shapes of a large ocean-going ship, but I don't want something that just looks like I built a model ship wrong. My other goal I had for this project was to build something with lighting. While I've done things with electronics in the past, it's been at least 2 years, and certainly not since I had the filming setup that I have now. So while this won't be my first time trying it out, I definitely consider myself a beginner when it comes to adding electronics to my projects, but I'll talk more about that later. Once everything is clipped and free of the sprue, I can start testing out some shapes. I like having sticky tack for this step, because if I find an arrangement I like, I can hold things together without fully committing. I really want to find a place for the main body of the Saturn V, but I just don't know if it's going to work out. It's pretty big. The other thing that I'm keeping in mind is that I want the interior to be easily accessible, so that I can manage all the electronics without having to do a whole lot of pre-planning of where they're going to fit. I like how the bottom is starting to work out, but I want to add more space in the middle, so I pulled out these chunks of what I think was a nerf gun at one point. They've got some odd little rails that help them fit perfectly onto the hull. I don't really remember what I used the rest of it for, but the cuts are chewed right to hell. I was not being careful when I used them last. This is a good start, but I've still got a lot to fill in. In particular, I want to have a big chunky rocket booster on the back here, that I can add some lights to. These plastic pipe fittings or something are almost the same diameter as the Saturn V parts, so they're a perfect starting point. I wasn't totally set on doing the engine this way, till I realized that those parts are almost the perfect size to fit in the space I'd created with the nerf parts. Though I'd need to make a bit more room by cutting down the tip of the ship hull here. I pretty quickly realized that I could use the two halves of the Saturn V separately on the sides, instead of trying to jam the entire tube in the center. This was really a key moment, I think, because it's when this whole construction started to feel a bit more like a spaceship rather than a bunch of boat pieces. Once I decided on the basic layout, I pulled off all the sticky tack and started thinking about how everything would go together more permanently. The first step of that is taking the tip off of this hull to make room for the engines. Fortunately, a Dremel with a cutting disc makes pretty quick work of that. I have a bad habit of letting the plastic get too hot and melt when I use the Dremel, but a hobby knife does a just fine job of cleaning up the crud. As always, my favorite adhesive is Weld On 3, which is a plastic cement. I know it says it works on acrylics right on the front there, but it works just as well on polystyrene, which is the kind of plastic injection molded kits are made from. It evaporates pretty fast though, and it's real smelly, so I portion it out into my trusty soda can bottom for easy application. I wasn't sure what kind of plastic the nerf gun parts were made of, but I did some tests on a smaller piece, and the weld-on melts it only a little bit slower than it does styrene. Next, I want to find a good way to attach these halves of the Saturn V, but they're a bit flimsy and don't have much surface area to grab onto. Fortunately, I have some advanced technology at my disposal, so I measured the diameter of the curve, and then once I knew how big it needed to be, I used my cutting machine to make some styrene semicircles to fit along the inside. They came out of the styrene a bit rough, but after a touch-up with a sanding stick, they fit perfectly. Before any of those parts can go on though, I want to close up some of the gaps in the hull before they're harder to access. Then, before I could do more construction, I got completely distracted by my drawer full of colorful circles because I wanted to put together a more final version of the engines. This little funnel piece has threading and some raised text on the inside that needs to be removed, which the Dremel is perfect for. The last step on the engine is drilling out a little hole for the LED. Finally, once I'm done being distracted, it's time to get back to the superstructure. I need to fill this big gap here on the front, and this chunk of a boat has these neat little pre-made boxes that I think will be a perfect fit. Once again, the cutting tool in my Dremel does the job. I'm almost done with the main hull, but now there's a big old gap right smack dab in the middle that needs to be addressed. Fortunately, I've got these X-Wing wings that fit just about right once I've cut them apart. Next, I'm going to fill in a few of the holes in this section that I'm going to use for the top. prow has this big empty spot right now. So to fill it in, I'm using a flat piece of styrene and then the chunk of the hull that I cut off earlier. That still leaves a little bit of space, which I'm going to close up by bulking up the top. The edges here I had to cut to a pretty specific shape to line up cleanly with the nerf parts. Next, I want to add more detail to the big tubes on the side, which right now are a little bland. This tan piece here is part of a tank turret I sliced in half, and then a chunk of the Saturn V capsule helps integrate it more with the rest of the ship. While I was doing that, I realized that there was a big gap in the top here where the X-Wing parts didn't quite line up with the lid. To fill that space and help everything stay in place, I'm adding some styrene to the top. It's at this point that I can finally just hold the whole thing in my hands without having to clamp it together, which is a very satisfying moment. I'm going to add a few more shapes just to add surface detail, and then get to putting together the wiring for the lights. It's been a while since I've done this, so I started by just pulling out everything I knew that I would need. Now, I'm not going to be putting together too complicated of a circuit, but it's still a good idea to draw everything out first so that I have a guide to follow when I'm wrangling wires. My soldering skills are basically non-existent, so I apologize to everyone watching me do this and cringing hard at whatever it is that I'm doing wrong, because I definitely know I'm doing something wrong. Anyway, it took a little bit of trial and error, but eventually I managed to get all of the connections soldered and wrapped. The only thing left to do was put the batteries in and hope that it all worked. Luckily for me, I managed to put everything in place where it needed to go, and none of the solders came loose to boot. Of course, because I couldn't make things easy for myself, I wasn't just going to stick the lights wherever and call it good. I wanted to use some fiber optic cables to make running lights that looked like tiny windows or something. Now, I don't know how you're supposed to buy a fiber optic cable, but I got mine by harvesting from this rainbow lamp thing. To make sure that my scheme is all going to work, I put together this little box to hold the fibers on one end and an LED on the other. Once I was satisfied that this would actually work, I made a pair that would fit snugly into the interior of the ship, using a few extra semicircles that I cut out earlier. From there, it was time to fill in some of the more egregious gaps in the ship using some epoxy putty. I've used a few different solutions for gap filling, but this is my first time using epoxy putty. Overall, I found it a little bit messy, but that could just be because I need more practice using it. Coming back the next day, it was fully cured and I could sand all of the edges clean. It's still a little messy though, so I'm going to add some styrene panels to cover up the rougher sections. At this point, I wanted to actually glue the engine into place, but before I could do that, the areas it would partially cover needed some more details. For this, I cut up a circular bit of sprue that fit nicely into those spots. Finally, it's time to start adding all of the smaller details that I've been saving up this whole time. I was particularly looking forward to Greebling on this project because I finally got a hold of some guitar strings. I've seen them used on all kinds of other crafting channels, and I can confirm that they are perfect for making little tubes and cables stand out in a way that they wouldn't if I were just using plain old wire. I also haven't forgotten about the top section, which doesn't have as much space for detail, but the front chunk here definitely deserves some attention. I used what I think is part of the bridge tower from some kit or another, but I like to imagine that this is actually a big observation deck on the front of the ship. The last thing to do before I start installing the lighting was adding some more detail to go along the top, which right now is looking pretty bare. I want some nice boxy and busy looking structures, which I'm assembling from various ship bits that were slightly too weirdly shaped to go anywhere else. Finally, it's time to get to wiring up the lights on the inside. Before I do that though, did you know that I'm selling stickers now? I've got 4 different designs, all illustrated by me, and featuring 3 of my original spaceships, as well as my logo. I'll include a link down to my Etsy, or you can get one for yourself, if you like stickers. Okay, back to lighting. I primed the surface gray and the interior black to prevent some light leakage and make it easier to find any remaining gaps. The LED holders I also painted black, and then I wanted to make sure that the fiber optic wires didn't escape, so I glued them into place. I used hot glue here because I was worried that super glue might disrupt the light transmission somehow, which was only kind of the right decision, and I'll explain that later. Next, I want to drill some holes for the wires to stick out of the sides, which proved to be an issue when I realized that the smallest drill bits that I have are still like 3 times bigger around than the fiber optic wires are. The solution I arrived at is starting a little pilot hole with the hobby knife and then poking the rest of the way through with a pin that's closer to the right size. The only problem with this plan was that the plastic I was trying to poke through was the Nerf gun, which is a lot thicker than I realized. So I used the Dremel to thin down the other side and in the process made a huge mess. Once that was done though, I had a bunch of tiny little holes that I could very carefully thread the fiber optic wire through. Once that was done, I wanted to glue the wires in place with hot glue like I did earlier. Unfortunately, as soon as I did, the wire I was gluing fully melted and curled right up. I didn't quite have it in frame here, but you can see that my hand freezes when I realize what happened. The wire is mostly salvageable, fortunately, and I intentionally hooked up a bunch of extras all just in case, but hot glue was clearly right out at this point. I wasn't too worried though, since I had done some testing with CA glue earlier and figured it would work just fine as an alternative. But when I came back to it the next day, thinking that everything would be all cured and ready to go, a few of the wires just popped right up at me when I opened the top. Apparently I shouldn't have trusted the testing that I'd done as much as I did, because it seemed like the CA glue, wherever it hadn't cured fast enough, actually started dissolving the wires. About a quarter of them I had to fully pull out, re-drill the holes, and replace. In the end, I just used regular white craft glue on the last few wires I was able to redo, and just accepted that some of them wouldn't be as bright as I wanted them to be because they'd been half melted. At this point, once the wires were all said and done, it was time to get to some proper painting. I had plenty of time to think about what kind of paint job I wanted as I was building, and because the whole project was made from real ocean-going ships, I'd been imagining it as some kind of huge passenger liner. A ship this big could carry thousands of people and millions of tons of cargo for some megacorp, making months-long round trips to distant colony worlds. So I wanted the paint job to reflect that, something that could give the impression of a giant cargo ship. Once I put down a layer of pre-shading, I decided to paint the lower half of the ship in red. I wasn't sure if I was going to like it once it was in place, but as soon as it started going on, I knew I'd made the right decision. The pre-shading adds just a whole bunch of depth to the color, and the red and gray makes it really feel like a piece of heavy machinery. Just 2 colors wasn't quite enough for me though, so I threw in some white stripes to break up the big blocks of red. I wanted all of these to have a worn appearance, so I stippled them on using some foam. This is a quick and dirty one-step approach to weathering, but honestly, I like it. These little interior corners wouldn't have worn away nearly as much since they're more protected, so I went in with a brush to fill those spots in. I painted the engine black, but I felt like it was a bit too dark, so I brightened it up with a coppery metallic dry brushing. That wasn't quite enough for me though, so I hit a few of the details with metallic Sharpies. Adding some shiny scuff marks in the engine bell will also helpfully catch some of the light from the LED. It's hard to see under the super bright painting lights, but trust me, it's working. Now, at this point, I want to move on to adding some decals, but before that, I want to add to the story of the ship being a corporate cargo hauler by putting a big logo on the prow. I drew this little logo in Affinity Designer and used my cutting machine to slice it out of some masking material. Once I figure out exactly where I want it to go, the transfer tape makes sure that that little dot in the middle stays exactly where it's supposed to be. Once the logo has gone on, I want to find some good decals for my collection here. I have historically found decals to be a bit of a pain in the butt to apply, but this is probably because until now I have not tried to use setting fluid, so hopefully that will make a difference this time around. And of course you'll be shocked to learn that yes, the product I bought to perform a specific task made that specific task a lot easier. Anyway, I spent a good amount of time applying decals to the top and a few along the sides as well. Once I was happy with that, I hit everything with a clear coat and got to applying an oil wash. With the oil wash finished, the last thing I wanted to add was a little reflector on the engine light. The LED was a bit too deep inside the model to scatter light like I wanted, so I took this transparent headlight or something and glued it into place. For the finishing touch, I made a nameplate on the cutting machine to put on the stand I put together off camera and called it a wrap. This was a big project. I mean, literally physically big. This thing is almost 18 inches tip to tail, but it also ended up challenging me in a lot of ways that I didn't expect. I certainly plan on including lights on more of my projects in the future, but man, I'm gonna do more research next time. And I'm gonna tell you, I made a real mess of the inside of this thing. Now, as always, if you like what you saw here and want to try scratch building a model ship of your own, I sell templates and instructions on my Etsy. I think they're a great introduction to the hobby, and buying one is the best way to support the channel so that I can keep making cool stuff. And I mentioned it earlier, but I'm also selling stickers now too, because I love stickers. Alright, that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.